Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For the next 30 to 40 minutes, we'll be covering the topic 9 cybersecurity habits to maximize engagement. Before we get started, let's go through some housekeeping items. So this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slide deck will be shared with you later today. Please use the Q&A feature to post any questions you might have for George and I today. We might either answer questions directly in the chat or save them for the live Q&A at the end of this webinar. And if you still have any questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or to the folks at hoxhunt.com. All right, that's all for the housekeeping items. So let's move on to introduction. And joining us today is George Finney. George is a chief security officer that believes that people are the key to solving our cybersecurity challenges. He's also the CEO and founder of Well-Aware Security and the CISO, so Chief Security Officer, for Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. George has worked in cybersecurity for nearly 20 years, and he's helped startups, global telecommunication firms, and nonprofits to improve their security posture. He's part of several advisory boards in security, and he's been recognized by Security Magazine as one of their top cybersecurity leaders. And finally, as a part of his passion for education, George has taught cybersecurity at universities, and he is the author of several cybersecurity books, including Well Aware, Master the 9 Cybersecurity Habits to Protect Your Future. And the latest one actually that got released last year is Project Zero Trust 2. So a warm welcome, George.
Oh, thank you so much for that warm introduction. I'm honored to be here, and I'm excited to talk about my passion, which is people in cybersecurity.
Me too. And we share the same passion. So I think we're going to have something interesting here. And listen, I've read your book, so Well Aware, recently. And what has really stuck with me is your ability to make the topic of cybersecurity something that is accessible to everyone, not only to security practitioners. In the book, you're combining stories from the front line to make the topic interesting, but also combining it with research from experts to anchor the book in science. So I've been really looking forward to our discussion. So as a reminder, we will be raffling off some signed copies of George's book, Well Aware, to some of today's attendees. If you're here and stick with us until the end, you have a chance to win. And if you do, we'll be following up via email to gather your shipping information. And my name is Maxime. I started my journey in cybersecurity about 9 years ago, and quite frankly, I found out very quickly that the human element was often forgotten or left out in cybersecurity projects when I started. So I decided to focus on it. And since then, I've led and contributed to security awareness, behavior, and culture programs for global companies in manufacturing, aerospace, retail. For example, leading the security culture program at H&M Group between 2019 and 2023. Today, I'm the founder of Habit Hackers, and I advise organizations with this topic simply because I'm fascinated by it and because I believe we can still make a huge difference in this area. So today, we've organized the webinar into 3 sections. First, we'll introduce why so many organizations struggle to engage employees when it comes to cybersecurity. Then George will describe the 9 cybersecurity habits that work together to influence positive security behaviors over time. And after that, we'll continue with the discussion to really deep dive into how we can solve the engagement issue with the 9 habits and any other topics we might find worth discussing at the time. So let's get started. I've been a part, or I've seen many security awareness, behavior, and culture change programs that are experimenting with quite innovative and different activities to drive engagement in cybersecurity. The goal is often to go beyond the annual compliance security training, as many security awareness leaders know that security can't be just one touch point during the year if they want to actually change behaviors. So most organizations that go beyond that actually deliver communication campaigns and perhaps champions network, short videos, escape rooms, live speaker events, and many different fun awareness activities, I would say. But despite all of those, engagement still feels like a challenge for a lot of us. Last year, a Sounds Institute study of 2,000 security awareness leaders found that the ability to engage employees was one of the top 5 challenges that they were facing. I've heard this all the time myself when I talk to fellow security awareness practitioners. One of the issues is that because of lack of time or budget, most security teams have to resort to sending quite general one-size-fits-all security messages, most of the time at least, and hope that the message will be relevant for most people and that they can break through the flood of corporate communications and reach out to the colleagues. So there are a lot of things that can be done to break out from the crowd, from the overall noise, but in my experience, even when our team managed to create a fantastic, fun, different, really well thought out, positive global training or communication campaign, well, our best ones reach about 20% of our colleagues. Maybe it might seem great, 20%, especially if you're improving from a state where you've had a much lower engagement before. But in the bigger scheme of things, it does mean that 80% of people are unengaged. And even for the 20% of people who are engaged, who are engaging with your campaign or your activities, well, we might not really know if we've made a real difference and reduced the risk. So that's what we'd like to talk about today with George. What can we do to reverse this and deliver cybersecurity programs that will lead to 80% of engagement? And perhaps also, how can we go beyond engagement? So George, the floor is yours.
I love this approach. I totally agree that there's so many challenges with engagements. And, what I've seen, and I've talked to a lot of CISOs, I'm a CISO practicing today, and we know we spend probably 1 or 2% of our cybersecurity budgets on people, right? On security training. And yet we also know that 95% of all data breaches, right? You look at the Verizon data breach report, they say that it's humans that are the cause of many of those breaches, right? So 1% of our efforts are going towards 95% of the problem, right? There's a huge gap there. And we'll dive in a little more into how we can manage that. But yeah, I find it such a challenge. And, we also have this thing in the industry, you've heard it before, I'm sure, people say people are the weakest link. People say security awareness training doesn't work. And I want to challenge that. Certainly, people are the biggest attack surface, right? We know that's where the bad guys these days are targeting their efforts. But I disagree that's true. And I think we should stop saying that, because it's actually, I think, more accurate to say that people are the only link, right? Think about people, processes, and technology. When we think about security, people are the ones that build the technology. They're the ones that configure the technology. They're the ones that use the technology. People are the ones that create the processes. People are the ones that follow the processes or not. It's not, like 3 equal slices of a pie. It's 100% people with like process and technology sprinkled in for flavor. And we've got to stop thinking from a technology focused solution. We've got to start thinking the human aspects of cybersecurity and helping people get to that 80% or 90% in terms of engagement. I think this is totally a solvable challenge. One of the things for the book Well Aware, I wrote it kind of as a professional development book for not just security awareness folks or even security people in general. The reason that I wrote it in such a readable way is I wanted it to be something we can give to anyone in our organizations, right? From the CEO to an accountant to your sales team, and have it be something that resonates with them. But if you're one of those people that believe that people are the weakest link and security awareness training doesn't work, I've got a challenge for you on this slide. So again, I did a deep dive into psychology and neuroscience for the book because I wanted to know what the most effective way is to train people, to get them to change their security behaviors. And so fascinating studies that have been done around this. But I think out of all the things that we'll probably talk about today, this is the most important one, right? So if you don't remember anything else, remember this. Look, humans are biologically wired to be really good at problem-solving tasks in the morning. We're bad at solving problems in the afternoon and evening. But a number of studies, right? So they study doctors. Doctors make fewer mistakes and find more issues in the morning versus the afternoon. So if you have to schedule your next procedure or whatever, schedule it in the morning, because doctors are better at making judgments, problem solving in the morning. Same true with judges and court cases. Same is true for students taking tests. the students taking the same test in the morning versus the afternoon perform significantly better in the morning. So if you've got to schedule that next certification exam, you know when to schedule it now. And so why is that the case? So the studies have shown that there's this hormone in your body. It's a stress hormone. It's called cortisol. Your body cleans it out as you sleep overnight, but then it starts building back up over throughout the day. So in the process of writing the book, I thought, okay, this has to apply to cybersecurity in some way. How do I look at that? So I had been sending simulated phishing campaigns for almost a decade. I've sent over 30,000 simulated phishing messages at this point in my career professionally. So I thought, okay, well, let me take that historical data and plot it on a time and day kind of chart. So this chart is the result of that. So when you look at the red line, you see that in the morning, people click less often than they do in the afternoon. And actually in the afternoon, people are 8 to 10 times more likely to click on a phishing message, right? This is that biological wiring that we have at work. And so again, I was giving this same presentation right after the book came out to a group of faculty at MIT. And one of them like jumped out of their chair and they were like, oh my God, George, I was a postdoc when this research was being done into time of day. And I helped with the research and it's the same graph. It's exactly the same graph, right? So again, I'm going to challenge those folks out there. If you believe that people are the weakest link and you believe that security awareness doesn't work, explain the morning to me, right? Why is it working in the morning and not working in the afternoon? I think this is one of the most critical elements to understand when it comes to security awareness and working with our humans in our organizations. So that's the red line. The green line, I thought, okay, cool. Well, let me see if there's some some other correlation here. So the green line is real reports of real phishing messages from our users through our ticketing system. Our users were 3 times more likely to report phishing messages in the morning versus the afternoon. So we probably experienced this, right? We get phishing messages at 4 o'clock on a Friday. The bad guys know, just like any good marketer knows when to send their marketing message to get the most effect. The bad guys know when our users are the most vulnerable. So the rest of the slides are going to take kind of a deeper dive into why this might be the case. But I think we've got to treat the whole person. We know, again, from those studies that the degree in difference between your performance problem solving in the morning versus the afternoon is actually as though you would consume the legal limit of alcohol in the afternoon. That's how big a performance difference is. And unfortunately, as humans, right, you've probably seen videos of people taking the field sobriety test after they've been drinking. And it's kind of funny, right? But that self-awareness isn't built into us to know when we're more effective than not. We have to take evidence to see how that plays out. So incredibly important that I think we understand the biology of our humans in order to be able to effectively get that increase in engagement. So let's think about how we can get better. So this image is a picture of a theory of neuroscience. It's called the triune brain theory. But the idea is that there are older parts of our brain, right, as we evolved over time. And these parts of the brain actually are responsible for different things. So the neocortex, right, that's the part of our brain that makes us the smartest animal on the planet. So in terms of power, it can really do basically anything, right? We can derive the theory of relativity with our neocortex. And, as you go further down, evolutionarily speaking, you get less powerful, but you also get faster. So the neocortex, we might be able to come up with the theory of relativity, but it might take a lifetime to come up with the theory of relativity, or maybe even to understand it for the rest of us. As you go further down, the limbic system is the part of the brain where emotions lie. And so in terms of power, what they think is the limbic system, most scientists would agree that the human brain probably experiences 6 or 8 primary emotions, and all of the flavors of those feelings are kind of subtleties thereof. So very limited in terms of bandwidth, if you will. But in terms of speed, right, how fast do you know how you feel about something? It's basically immediate. So much, much faster than the neocortex. The limbic system is also where decisions are made, by the way. So we make decisions emotionally not rationally, and often we'll make that decision based on a feeling, and then we'll reverse engineer the reasons why that's important within the neocortex just to maintain consistency in our brains. The final oldest part of the brain that we share with reptiles is called the reptilian brain. This stem kind of part of your brain is responsible for like fight or flight, but it's also responsible for habits. So in terms of power, it's not very powerful. It has to kind of be pre-programmed, and we'll talk about habits as we go a little further on. Habits are like pre-programming your brain to do something automatically when they receive a trigger. So in terms of power, very limited, in terms of your ability to respond. But in terms of speed, this is the fastest part of your brain. So they actually showed an image to some subjects that were in an MRI machine, and they showed it for less than 2/100ths of a second. So not fast enough for the human brain to even recognize that it's been shown an image. But they looked at the subject's brains, and they already started going into fight or flight mode. They already started reacting to danger picture that they saw. And so again, in terms of speed, it can react within less than 2/100ths of a second in order to keep us alive, right? That's why that part of the brain exists. And so, thinking about our security awareness programs in terms of this picture, right? If you're just presenting information to people, you're engaging the neocortex, right? That if it's intellectual information, if it needs to be remembered long term, that's where we're focusing. And that's good enough for the mornings. But as we go further down, that's going to really have that influence on the afternoon. So the limbic system, again, emotions, a lot of the things that we're doing in security awareness, more innovative stuff, right? It hits you in the feels, right? So, we have now training that, is funny, right? It's poignant. We see pictures of people in those images, and we want to have empathy with them. We start to get feelings, and that helps us become faster in our responses, right? So as you go further down, it gets faster. That's one of the things we need out of our security training programs. We need to tap into these older parts of the brain, but it's still not fast enough. The bad guys use, what are their main techniques? Fear, in order to get people to do whatever it is that they're doing. And that's triggering our reptilian brain, that fear-based response. And I think we're not, if we're only looking at the emotions, we're not going far enough in terms of engaging our humans in our organizations. But if we can leverage habits for behavior change when it comes to security awareness, right? Habits are part of the reptilian brain. Habits can respond in that fast of a manner. And so I think as we're thinking about the biology, the wetware of our human brains and human experiences, right? We've got to have it all the way down to the reptilian brain level in order to respond fast enough to make it automatic, so that it doesn't matter how much cortisol is in our brains in the afternoon, right? We're automatically going to be able to make the right decision. So I wrote the book Well Aware, and I think there are 9 cybersecurity habits that we can focus on, right? It's not, security isn't one habit, right, that's monolithic. There's lots of different aspects or elements to that. So the habits on the left-hand side of your screen, the first 4 habits, are all internal habits. They're things that we do on our own when we're working on a deadline or trying to solve a problem. So I think of these as the internal habits. The final 5 habits are external habits. They're things that you do when you're working with other people. And so this is a great start, understanding how to influence habits, right? Thinking about things, and I work in higher ed, so I think about things in terms of pedagogy. We need a process for teaching people how to learn security, and again, with a pedagogy, you can create structure for learning that helps people learn faster. So this is the first element. But as I wrote the book, I started to shift my thinking about how I educate people in my organization about security, and we built a security awareness company, Well Aware, that leverages these elements. And the biggest part of my shift in thinking is I started thinking not like a security czar or a cop or whatever, a boss. I think about my role more like a coach. So when I'm working with other humans, right, that's how we know the most effective way of training athletes is to coach them, right? We want to increase their performance. But at the same time, right, every coach will recognize that every athlete, every member of their team has a unique gift to bring to the team. And so, okay, that's awesome. how do we do that relative to security? Well, I want to help people find their inner strengths when it comes to security. I can't expect them to be perfect at everything all the time. I want to help them find their unique strengths and find their connection to the team. And so really this starts the idea of building an identity, right? So Maxime, you started with how do we make this personal for people? How do we increase engagement and make it more relevant for them? I think this is the way we do it. And so the next slide I think will show the personality test that we built. So you can scan that QR code if you're brave. You could also the URL and we'll go straight there. But we've got a free cyber personality test that we've developed in order to help people understand what their biggest internal strength is and what their biggest external strength is. So it's about 22 questions. It'll take about 5 minutes. So feel free to jump in now or save it for later. The next slide actually shows all of the different personality types. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the internal habits. And on the top of the screen, you'll see the 5 external habits. And where those two intersect is a unique place in security, just like Myers-Briggs or StrengthsFinder or some of those other personality tests. We're going to help root you in where your strengths are. So for me, I'm a cybersecurity explorer. So that means I have high vigilance, right? I'm always on the lookout for new things, new technologies, new vulnerabilities or threats. And I also have high diligence. So for me as a CISO, I'm always coming up with plans or processes or procedures to get out in front of those potential threats and practice them and work with other people. But I'll also note that I'm not perfect at everything. So when you take the test, you might be a cybersecurity scientist, you might be a cybersecurity navigator, and that's okay because we all work in teams. We need different perspectives. We need different strengths to complement one another in order to get better, right? So I have rooted myself in this identity as an explorer. And so for me, I'm going to develop a personalized coaching plan that builds on my strength of vigilance, that builds on my strength of diligence. The other folks on my team know that this is my personality and they can lean on me if they're not, if their strength isn't vigilance, they can ask, okay, what would George do in this situation? Or they can come ask me. And same for me, if I have a cyber community thing that I want to work through, and maybe I'm working on a new project and we have to keep it secret, I would hope maybe I have someone on my team that's a cybersecurity mastermind, where they have high secrecy and high community. So the next slide will show, I have done these assessments with different teams, really all over the world. And this is an example of one of the teams I did this assessment for, but you can kind of see again at a glance the team's makeup when it comes to the habits. So, each quadrant, if you will, is one of the internal habits, and each ring is one of the external habits. So you can see really right at a glance, this particular team is very strong at vigilance. And that actually perfectly aligned with this security team's goals and objectives. You don't have to just, take the test for security teams. It's designed for any team, HR, or, maybe a project team where a bunch of folks from different organizations all come together. But you want to be able to represent all of the different habits. And again, this particular team did have that balance, right? So, all of the rings and the quadrants are represented. I worked with another CISO to do an assessment for her team. And she was like, oh my gosh, I've got so many people in the literacy quadrant. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that normal? What does it mean? I was like, okay, well, here's what literacy means. It's about understanding what technology you're using, what your environment looks like, how you're using it, what data you have, where it's at, how are you protecting it? And she was like, oh my gosh, these 5 people that fell into the literacy quadrant are all my governance, risk, and compliance team. And that's what they do. They have those inventories, they have risk registers, they understand the business impact of different critical services. So again, there's no one size fits all approach, but you do need a balance. You do need to represent all the different habits. And hopefully your team aligns from a cybersecurity personality perspective with where your goals are. But from an individual level, right? This is where we started. How do I make security personal, right? And I think starting with understanding my own personality, helping individuals know who they are, right? But anybody that's ever taken the Myers-Briggs they know what their Myers-Briggs personality type is. That is really important to them. And so if we can connect with them and bond with them to say, wow, okay, I am a cybersecurity scientist. That makes total sense. Let me kind of build on that. They'll want to start learning more about what does it mean to be a scientist? Okay, cool. Yeah, I love culture, and I am a skeptic. My friends all say so. How do I build on that? How do I learn more? And how does that change my relationships with the folks that I'm working with? I think it's incredibly advantageous to be able to understand that, and that helps teams work together better. That helps individuals navigate their course better. So that's kind of where I've come to with how to make security training personal for folks and how to shift culture more effectively. Because we know we have a limited amount of time with our employees to engage with them, and we've got to maximize that limited amount of time.
Thanks a lot, George. I've done the test myself, and I'm a cybersecurity rebel. I was not too surprised with the results, considering I feel that I've been often fighting, to highlight the importance of the human element in cybersecurity teams, and how we needed to show empathy for staff to make security easy. And I've not always been afraid to bypass processes or hierarchies to make that happen. So that's who I am. But
I
great
love that.
test. And what I'm curious to hear about is how to put that in practice in an organization. So a couple of years ago, I've heard you in another webinar where you say that in SMU you divided your staff in 4 categories. Are those the 4 categories that you showed before? So literacy, skepticism, or 4 other categories?
I'm so fortunate to be able to be at an organization where I can experiment
Yeah.
and kind of play around with some of this. So yeah, we have done. I eat my own dog food. We've created our own security training program, and folks have taken it. It's been really interesting to see the breakdown of where people fall. There's some commonalities, and I think knowing where your team is at, right, in terms of, okay, this department is heavily represented around literacy, for example. It helps me inform more about how to deliver training, what training is relevant for them. I hear a lot of folks complain about simulated phishing repeat offenders, right? So that they're always the ones that click. And how many times can we have people fail? Well, we want to create a safe learning environment for them. We need to understand the larger context of what they're working in, right? One of the CISOs I worked with, they had a business email compromise situation. And as they delved more into it, they realized that this particular department, they had made a mistake a couple of years ago, and their management said, okay, now our biggest push is to make sure we respond to every email in under 5 minutes. So what did they do in terms of culture? Well, they started pushing, we've got to respond faster, we've got to get invoice processed right away, because one time they missed one and it took too long. And that was an important one. They shifted their strategy, but oh my gosh, that made them even more susceptible to phishing emails, right? If you've only got 5 minutes, that clock is ticking. Your boss is gonna jump all over you. If that's the culture, the environment you're in, how do you have the time to really recognize red flags or what have you? You don't. And so they unfortunately were the victim of a couple $1 million in lost funds that got shipped out because that's there. And so, thinking about that department, this is another one of our clients. Oh my gosh, how would the CISO have known that that's the culture, that's the environment that those individuals were working in? And, that pressure kind of takes away from the ability to kind of use your own strengths and lean on other team members to help. We don't operate in a vacuum at all. So, again, thinking about how we can build those teams up and make them more engaged and self-sufficient and deputize them, right? This is a way of helping them see themselves as a part of security and helping prevent multi-million-dollar fund transfers that could potentially, make a company go out of business. That's what we're talking about. And having those different flavors, right? Everybody can see, okay, yeah, I identify with this. I I'm the same personality as George. Let's work together. I think that's really what makes the difference when it comes to security is having that empathy, like you talked about, for people.
Yeah, thanks. I love that example because it makes me think of another example is quite a bit similar where same thing in an organization. We noticed that there was a high click rate in a certain department. And when we started to investigate why by just talking to people, we realized that in their job, they were communicating with a lot of suppliers, a lot of vendors that they didn't always know. And that was just part of the job to communicate with the suppliers and receive the invoices and opening the attachments, that was their job. They didn't know these people, but that was the job.
Yeah.
So we needed to just adapt the type of advice that we gave to these people, the type of environment, technological environment that we gave to them to be able to protect them and protect the company, just because the general advice that we gave somewhere else just couldn't work for them.
Exactly. And if you're at an organization that's global, you may have very different cultures in Asia Pacific, right, versus Europe versus South America, right? All of those different cultural aspects, will shift between different departments. Navigating that is such a challenge. And so again, I think bringing that back, right? You can't have a one size fits all approach in those ways. So how do you do that? Well, I think you do that by understanding individual strengths and their personality types. Just critical to be able to connect with people and help them kind of express themselves in a way, right? Again, we don't have that self-awareness. I didn't know what my cyber personality test would be even before I created the test, right? I was totally wrong when I guessed what I would be, and it makes so much of a difference.
Mm. And I'm curious if you're talking about global organizations, and so if you have thousands and thousands or thousands of thousands of colleagues, and let's say that you've started to identify some personas or some groups of people, for example, with this assessment. From that, do you only use that for your discussions and to find out, with the leaders of this department of this country, how to adapt your actions? Or do you actually have, and it's fine if you don't, I'm just curious, I would say different type of trainings or different type of communication packages that are already ready for different type of people?
Yeah. So again, I want to start with the low hanging fruit.
Mm.
And again, my personality type, it's going to make more sense for me to focus on vigilance. But for you as a rebel, we'll need to study literacy, right? And so we've got different tracks that we can put folks on. We've introduced this kind of concept of habit recipes. So we want to meet people where they are, right? So even, again, as a cyber rebel, you might have a different experience, different needs as a person than maybe a single mom, raising a bunch of kids who's an accountant. You're going to have different experiences. And so instead of telling people what to do, right, never write your password down and then slapping their hand when they do it because they've got 500 passwords to remember, we want to meet people in the middle, right? So with this habit recipe based approach, it understands habits, but it also allows people, we call it a recipe because there's no judgment about switching ingredients, right? So, okay, we know we want to say, encourage folks to use a password manager, password vault, but maybe that's not my strength. How do I get people to adopt that new different behavior? Again, I think you've got to have it rooted both in an approach that understands their personality, but also understands the different elements, right? I work out every day. That's something that's important to me. Maybe I'm going to choose a path for that person that's different for, again, a sales person who's a bachelor that is always on the road. Different people live their lives differently. And I think as security practitioners, wanting them to adopt safe behaviors, we've got to take that into account. So there's the personality type. There's also, what interests people have and drive them. The other fascinating thing that I talked about in the book is you don't need on day one to get to 90% engagement. That's probably not a realistic goal. But the University of Penn, one of their researchers did a study on behavior change and sustainable culture change. And actually, they found that 25% is the tipping point. So if you can just get 25% of your employees engaged highly and connected with this personality-based approach, thinking about changing habits, that is going to be the tipping point that gets everybody else to do it, right? They're going to start to follow that example. It's going to become embedded in the culture and become sustainable. So I think the first step, get to 25%, right? Have an engagement that really connects with people that they can personalize and bring home to their families, and think about how to do security and in a sustainable way, right? How to make it a long-term behavior change. And we already have those kinds of programs in our organizations, right? We call them wellness programs, and our HR departments have been really successful in tricking people to quit smoking or drinking or eat healthier and start working out, right? They incentivize those things. I think we can take that same approach, right? We already know that wellness programs are super effective at lowering insurance premiums. I think a cyber wellness program is going to be just as effective at lowering our cyber insurance rates, decreasing our overall potential account compromise rates, and protect us from those bad actors out there that are trying to do BEC fraud or identity theft of our organizations. It can have such a huge impact, both for the organization, but also for the person, right? I can't reiterate enough how awful it is for people who are victims of those things. Like personally, they worry about getting fired, and we are in a really unique role in security because we have an ability to help them avoid those bad things.
And so we talked about how to make things more engaging, it's important to make them different for different people based on those type of personalities, for example. But you also have a point in your book where you explain that it's not only about that, it's also about making the trainings, for example, the content kind of progressive. Maybe you want to explain, tell us a bit more about this.
Yeah, so a lot of folks have gone to college. Even if you haven't been to college, you probably know that when you start college, you do like the 101 level class, and then you do the 202 level class, and then the 303, right? You progress, whether it's English or math or whatever it is. Too often, our security training programs are one size fits all, right? This has been one of the biggest complaints that I've heard from everyone is, well, we have the training, whatever the training provider is, and it's the same training every year over year. And so just like with other HR trainings that people hate and feel like they're a waste of time, if you're just given the same training every year, your users are probably tired of it. They're like, man, I've seen this same thing for the last 3 or 4 years. Cool, I'm just going to tune out at this point. I already know this. That's a horrible outcome. That's one of the reasons why people are disengaged. And so if you can create a training plan that's progressive, that builds on their knowledge, that's personal to them, right? My personality type as an explorer, I'm going to start to build momentum. And we'll start with the low-hanging fruit of, okay, I'm going to build up my unique personality type for, vigilance, cool. Okay, I'm strong at that. But again, that reinforces my identity that I am someone that values security. Whether you're doing monthly, micro-learning trainings or annual trainings, what's next after that? Well, we need you to start learning, secrecy, and we want to reinforce that as an organization. So step 2 for you, maybe year 1, produce micro-learning training videos that focus on habit recipes. But okay, maybe in year 2, we're going to expand to a new habit for you. Maybe, quarterly we'll throw in a role-based scenario where you can take some of the 9 habits and actually see them in practice, not just for your personality type, but for your role, whether it's accounts payable or HR or IT. Everybody plays a role in security today, right? HR in terms of onboarding and offboarding, doing training, getting in front of people, accounts payable in terms of not paying, email fraud for invoices or what have you, all across the board. We can keep building on that platform, if you will, of the 9 habits, and having that pedagogy again, right? We know, okay, year 2, 3, 4, 5, here's where you started and here's where you're going to grow to. And instead of just having, okay, cool, we want to have a fun video that, gets everybody engaged. Okay, well, it's too expensive to keep producing those. We'll just show the same videos every week. That's not really building their knowledge. That's not really, changing, nudging their behavior over time. We've got to think about the single most important metric for a security awareness training program. How do you know whether it's effective? That metric is behavior change. So in thinking about habits, this is one of the other things that I found fascinating. 50% of all human behavior, 50% is based in habits, right? So half of everything that you've done so far today, you've been on autopilot, right? Whether it's you're driving to work, you usually follow the same path, whether it's you're making breakfast or lunch, you kind of go into that zone, right? Where you're just doing the same things that you've always done. If you're not thinking about habits, you're missing half the person. And so having that pedagogy for habits and a framework for long-term sustainable behavior change, I think that's really the best way, the most effective way to approach it, because we're in it for the long haul, right? We have to connect with our employees, and we want our employees to stick around. And gosh, having something, 5-6 years in that's still refreshing that person's unique personality types, their unique contributions, but also they've grown over time. Now they have a family, and how do I protect my kids? I've gotten promotion. Now, what do I do as a supervisor? How can I build on that? Those are the things that I look for in a progressive program.
I love this. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about engagement today. That was the end goal. But as you say, in the end, it's about the behaviors. It's about changing these behaviors on the long term. So thanks for adding that. I would love to continue this discussion forever, I think, but being conscious of people's time, I have one last question for you. We've seen quickly on the screen the 9 habits, and I really encourage everyone to read George's book, Well Aware, to read more about these habits. But could you tell us, George, what's, in your opinion, the most important of all this?
I love that. So one of the first questions I got when I published the book, we went on a book tour, and the first question out of the audience was like, "Okay, dude, 9 habits, that's great. 9 is way too many. Just give me the one." I would say, okay, if let's focus on your personality, maybe there are 2, internal and external. But really, if you only want one, the most important habit out of all the 9 habits, even if it's not a part of your personality naturally, focus on community. 100% the most important thing in security, right? You might be the biggest, strongest person out there, but you're still going to be vulnerable for at least a third of your life when you're sleeping. That's why we come together as a species, right? It's for mutual protection. And so, when we think about security, right, every industry has their own information security advisory council where they share information. That's an example of community from a corporate level. From an individual level, right? You think about like the Ring app or the Nextdoor app. Those are, they all have communities where people share information about package thefts, or I heard gunshots, or somebody stole my car or broke in. Those are communities around security. Think about just the 5-star rating system on Amazon or eBay, right? That's a way for communities to work together to say like, no, this shop is a total fraud. They're not even going to ship it to you. Those are communities that help us stay safe. And we all have our own existing communities today, right? Whether that's your family, your neighborhood, or a church group, or your alumni network, for whatever, right? We all have these communities. Accountants have their own communities. Salespeople have their own communities where they share ideas and information. All of those communities, you can leverage those, and every single one of them should be talking about cybersecurity today because it's the #1 topic on everyone's mind. We're all impacted by it. So think about community. If you need to just focus on one, focus on that and get engagement, and you'll start hearing and learning from other people. We'll share stories. You'll be able to be on the lookout more for potential new threats. Community is the most important of all the 9 cybersecurity habits, for sure.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great way to conclude this discussion, because I would say that having listened to this webinar makes all of the participants today also a part of this community, and I hope that this discussion will have a ripple effect on other communities. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll be following up soon via email with a webinar recording and some related resources if you'd like to continue learning. And again, feel free to reach out to George or me via LinkedIn or get in touch with the Hoxhunt team at hoxhunt.com.